This is the Future Christian Podcast, a conversation about church leadership, fresh ideas, and the future of the church. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Jack Shatama. Jack is the director of the Center for Vital Leadership, which serves the Peninsula Delaware and Baltimore, Washington conferences of the United Methodist Church, UMC. He is an ordained UMC minister and the author of 4 books: Anxious Church, Anxious People, How to Lead Change in an Age of Anxiety, One New Habit, One Big Goal, Change Your Life in 10 Weeks, If You Met My Family, You'd Understand, a Family Systems Primer, and Everyone Loves a Non-Anxious Presence, Calm Down, Grow Up, and Live Your Best Life. Jack and his wife of 44 years, Jody, have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. Jack is an avid runner and has completed the Baltimore Marathon 3 times. He occasionally plays guitar and bass in the Jacob's Well Band, his church's worship band. He enjoys all kinds of sports, cooking, reading, traveling, and most of all, seeing people experience spiritual growth. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. Your support means a lot to us in making this podcast possible.
This is Loren Richmond Jr., and today I'm excited to talk once again with Jack Shatama. Hello and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Loren. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having this conversation. Jack has been a past guest, I don't know, a couple of times at least, I think, right?
Yeah, I think twice, yeah.
So I'll make sure to link those episodes in the show notes. Again, since you've been on, we don't need to go too far in depth on this, but do you want to just share a little bit about your background, faith journey, all that stuff?
Sure. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church. I served in pastoral ministry for 9 years. Then I ran United Methodist Camp and Retreat Ministry for 23 years and have been, throughout that time, really felt like family systems theory was something that helped me as a leader and as a person. And so started writing about it back in 2016. I've written a few books on it and do a podcast and just try to help people apply that. What I like to say is I try to help people lead as a non-anxious presence personally and professionally. So that's kind of my area of focus, and it's really just sharing what has been helpful to me.
Well, highly recommend his podcast. Jack, I always listen, and I think it's just like, even if you're saying the same thing over and over again, which you basically are, right? Like that's what that's what this is.
That's right.
Like for me, just hearing it in different ways, in different explanations, like I think it's really helped me understand it really well. And Jack always does it in your 10, 15-minute episodes, so it's not like a long, hard commitment. So I think that's really helpful. I do want to ask this, Jack. This will probably, I don't know if this will air or released by time Lent is over, as we are right in the beginning of Lent. What Ash Wednesday, as we're recording this, was 2 days ago now.
2 days ago, right? Yeah.
But I'm thinking about spiritual practices, and something, again, I learned from your podcast is the idea of micro habits and small steps. So something I've tried to do is sit, I put a Bible in this chair that I'm sitting in. So what I'm trying to do for my habit for Lent is just grab my Bible and read a chapter of one of the Gospels. I started a week prior, so I've got some momentum build up. But talk a little bit, because that's a question I usually ask us is about spiritual practices. But since you're always so good about habit formation and micro goals or what have you, talk real quick about how people can utilize the micro goals or micro steps to build a good habit, spiritual practice for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is so important for having a thriving spiritual life, and as you probably know, the hardest part with anything is starting. In fact, the kind of the root in procrastination is that we don't start. We just keep putting it off and putting it off. And if you're like me, you procrastinate something, and then when you finally start it, it's like, oh, this wasn't that bad. And so, in habit formation, they call it friction. It's the friction of starting, right? And so if you can just get yourself to start, then that you then start to develop that habit of starting. And so that's what that micro habit is. When you put that Bible in your chair and you sit down, you're especially if you're telling yourself, I only have to read for a minute, or I don't even have to read, I just have to hold it, or whatever. If you get in the habit of doing that, then the reading part becomes easier and easier. And so I think when people are trying to start something, that what they call removing the friction, removing the things that get in the way of actually starting that is really important. And then once you have, say, a routine, adding something is really easy because you've already, you just say, okay, after I do this, I'm going to do this. And over time you kind of get in that habit where you're able to string things together. And so, I know not everybody's a morning person, but you can do this in the evening too. You can have an evening routine. And once you get into that habit, you can start to build on that and add things to it.
What's been so interesting for me, even beyond spiritual practices, Jack, and I suppose I shouldn't get too far into this, but like I'm just thinking about in my own, some things that I've tried over the last year with small, like I use the word small bets. So like I'm trying a small bet with my hair right now, to be frank, for listeners. But it's to the point where it's like, it doesn't seem like it's like, I don't need this. It's like, oh, it's just the natural next step, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, so and they call it habit stacking, when I do when I insert something or add something to a routine, I don't say I got to do this forever. I just say I'm going to do this and see how it goes. And that way you can adjust, you can pivot, you can drop it. And I think that when you tell yourself that you got to do something forever, or even for a month or 3 months, all of a sudden there are parts of you that may start to resist. And it's not bad to have a goal, So if you want to get through so many books of the Bible or something or whatever, it's not bad to have a goal. But I've often I did morning pages for a long time. That's that freehand writing. And that was part of my morning routine. And then at a certain point, I probably did it for a couple of years. And at a certain point, it was just like, you know what? I'm not getting anything out of this anymore. And I dropped it. It's okay.
Well, this is a good conversation. And speaking of, we've already talked a little bit about what I want to have Jack on about, and certainly what he's mentioned in his bio. But so this is kind of a weird way of going about this conversation, but I was recently reading the book The Vanishing Church by Ryan Bird. It's the new book that came out from a sociologist of religion who's really kind of risen to fame for the last several years, especially for his work within American Christianity, I think, and the mainline. But as I was reading his book, I just couldn't help but think and recognize family systems trends within much of the data that Bird was, highlighting. And Jack and I had already scheduled this conversation, so I thought, boy, I thought would be interesting to have this conversation framed around, a family systems lens. So let me start with this, because one of the things that I noticed from Bird is that he argues that the decline of the mainline Protestantism writ large has coincided with rising polarization. So you're a mainline pastor. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And if so, like what's like the family systems concept going on there?
Yeah, so the concept is Edwin Friedman in The Failure of Nerve called it a chronically anxious society. And he was actually that was in the mid 90s when he wrote that. And he was actually building on something Murray Bowen talked about, the founder of family systems theory, as early as the late 60s and early 70s. And that was this idea of societal regression.
Mm-hmm.
And societal regression, it happens when there's this chronic anxiety in the society, and it results in increased polarization. So Burge, I think, is right on, and we've seen that in nearly every aspect of society, at least in our country, in the U.S. But I would say most of the world, you're seeing that kind of polarization. And what happens is when there's that kind of chronic anxiety, people lose tolerance for ambiguity. It's impossible for many people, if not most people, to allow for difference, to allow for the fact that there might not be one right answer, and so people are looking for clear and rigid positions. And so this idea that people have to have that answer creates this kind of polarization, and the church was not immune to that. In fact, I think one episode I did with you is kind of on the United Methodist Church and the split there. We split just like every other mainline denomination over human sexuality. And I argue that was actually an emotional triangle, that the actual anxiety in the church was over this decline of mainline Christianity. And instead of focusing on, what that meant, it was easy to just focus on human sexuality and blame the other side and say, well, if you had the right position, we'd be just fine. And I think as we found from every denomination that has split, now, that wasn't it. That wasn't going to take care of that. And so, I think Burge is probably right on there in terms of this idea that the middle has just disappeared.
So this leads me to something else that I've been pondering. You mentioned Friedman, right? Because he wrote Failure of Nerve. When did he write that?
He wrote it in the early to mid 90s. He died in 1996, and then it was published posthumously it wasn't even finished, but some of his colleagues and I think his daughter finished it. And it's been pretty well widely read and pretty impactful, I think.
This is what I'm thinking. So Christian Smith, who's another sociologist of religion, I have an interview with him set up. He just published a book somewhat recently, why religion went obsolete in America, or something to that effect. Burge also sort of has a similar timeline of like the 90s, like early 90s, being kind of like the tipping point, to use like a Malcolm Gladwell terminology, of like when things started going downhill for religion. And I'm thinking about this because, again, you mentioned Friedman. If I'm remembering the book correctly, he talks about like his times being like chronically anxious, which, well, my goodness, imagine if he lived for today. But I'm wondering, like, Jack, do you think like this is just a hunch in my, and you might disagree, but Did the fall of the Berlin Wall, so to speak, was that like the hinge point that we're not talking about enough of, like, all of a sudden, like, so many of the things that religion was doing for America stopped being necessary, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so the fall of the Berlin Wall, according to Michael Kerr, so it was actually something else. Let me go back to religion itself, and I think that for a long time, Christianity in America was an identity.
Yeah.
And but then starting in the 60s, I think it started to lose its hold on people as an identity. And I think I don't know if Burge talks about identity, but this idea that this is who I am. I am a Christian, right? And then there are so many other things that took over what people could be.
Right.
I'm a feminist. I'm a pro-lifer. Well, pro-lifer is Yeah, you could say I'm a Christian and then pro-life is part of that. But that actually starts to take over the identity as opposed to being a follower of Jesus. So I think that's one thing. That's one place that Christianity started to lose its hold on people. And then this fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, I think I did a podcast episode on this, the scapegoating one.
Yeah.
That's Michael Kerr. Yeah, Michael Kerr contends that the U.S. always had to have a scapegoat, that had to have an emotional triangle, and early on it was indigenous people and slaves, enslaved Africans, and that held even past slavery, right, through Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
The civil rights era started to upend that. Secondarily, the other scapegoat was women.
Yeah.
Feminism started to unravel that, but we still had communism, and we could still focus on that outside threat. And when what he contends is when the Berlin Wall fell, we lost our last scapegoat, and that's when we started to really turn on each other. That's when we had nobody else to blame, and so we had to, that's when the polarization really got a lot worse. And I think you can make an argument for that. Certainly, time wise, you start to see how that polarization just has gotten worse and worse.
Why hasn't certainly there are some voices in America right now who are trying to make immigrants like the scapegoat, but I don't think that's really tracked. Is it just because social media has us scapegoating so many things, including one another?
Yeah, it's too easy because of the polarization to have your own scapegoat, but we don't have a common one. And in fact, it could have been Russia again, it maybe could have been China, but that's not working either. And in fact, Bowen said that this societal regression was going to continue until the middle part of the 21st century, until a major crisis caused us to have to work together. And I'm hoping that major crisis is not a world war. I'm hoping it's not a financial disaster like the Depression. What I'm hoping it is that climate change gets so bad that we actually have to start to work together to deal with our environment. But we'll see. We'll see if Bowen's right on that. But he certainly his prediction about societal regression has been on track so far.
So why wasn't COVID then that sort of opportunity to work together?
It could have been.
Right?
Yes, it could have been. And it wasn't. And so I think it was a missed opportunity. And I think the polarization in our society was just too strong, where, because depending on where you stood on science and on masks and on vaccines and all of those things, those became easy emotional triangles where you focused on them and why the other side was wrong instead of actually focusing on how we might all get through this together. And maybe leadership had something to do with that too. I don't know. I won't name names, but yeah.
Jack, your comment on masks makes me think something that I feel like I repeat on verbatim from hearing it from you so much. Content, not process.
Yeah.
That 5 years ago, the people who were debating masks, using masks, now were swearing by masks. Again, broad brush here.
Yeah.
Feels like the perfect analogy of content, a process versus content. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, so the idea that it's process, not content, is this idea that our emotional reactivity gets us blaming somebody else, arguing with somebody else, not taking responsibility for self. And so with COVID, one of the ways you could take responsibility for self was you could wear a mask, you could isolate, you could, and that's fine and well and good until you start to tell other people they have to do it. And so now you can make the case, it's for the common good that everybody has to do it. But at the same time, because our society is already polarized, as soon as, in this case, it would have been the Biden administration, started to tell states what they had to do, the focus then became on the mask itself. That's the content, instead of how are people taking responsibility for keeping themselves healthy, keeping their families healthy, keeping their communities healthy. And then the same thing was true for vaccines. And so I'm not blaming Biden. I'm not blaming Trump. They each had their side.
Right.
But I do think this is true of both progressives and conservatives right now. They're trying to demand what other people should do, instead of inviting them to think about what the common good is. And we've lost that whole sense of what the common good is.
Well, that's helpful the way you're framing it, because rather than saying like, to take care of the common good, you have to wear a mask, which was certainly, I think, how it was framed. And certainly I was in agreement with that, but I'm appreciating,
I was too.
I'm appreciating your perspective, though, that it might have been more helpful in the long run to say, like, hey, we all need to take care of the common good. Here are some ways you could do that, for instance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because one of the things that probably would have happened if that were the case is the people who wore masks would be much less susceptible to COVID, and the people who didn't would have been much more susceptible. And we know back then it was it was deadly, in a lot of cases.
Well, I worked in the hospital during like that second COVID wave, and it certainly that was the people who we were seeing in the hospital were folks who had resisted getting a vaccine and so forth and whatnot. But it's really interesting to think about, again, that process versus content, and how it's so much easier just to try to, and then we get into, I suppose, a conflict of wills. So talk about that for our audience, because I think that's what it became, right?
Right. And that's what just about everything is right now. So a conflict of wills occurs when we're talking in family systems terms, when you try to define another person. So what is healthy is to define yourself. This is what I believe. When you start telling other people what they should do, have to do, when you're defining them, the automatic response is to push back. And I don't know that any of us are immune to this. And there's a lot of good research that shows when you try to tell somebody what they should do, they not only will push back, they will actually dig in. And I know this personally, because when my wife tells me what to do, I don't want to do it, even if I was going to do it to begin with.
I'm laughing, Jack, because I just realized this like a few weeks ago, where I told my wife, I'm like, I'm having a conflict of wills with my 8-year-old son.
Yeah, right.
And I'm still trying to figure out like how to communicate with him so it's not a conflict of wills. But I'm like, this is what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and parenting really muddies that, because I think you and I had an email exchange about this one time.
So.
As a parent, you're still responsible for the care of the child, right? And so, do we really need to keep them from doing that? Are they going to be unsafe or not? I mean, we have to make these discernments. But I think the way Bowen or Friedman would put it is, when you're able to set a healthy boundary with a child, and say, I know you want to do this, or I know you don't want to do this, but this is what I'm expecting from you. And if you don't, here's the consequence, right? It's up to you to decide what you want to do, right? And that is the same with an 8-year-old, and it's as it is with the lay leader in a church who's acting up, or somebody who's opposing you politically. It's being able to say what you are willing to do, and then giving the other person the choice to how they're going to respond. The problem is, like, with my problem when I was raising kids was I would get angry, and if they didn't do it, and then as soon as you get angry, that's reactivity. You lose your moral authority, and so.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of gone off on a family systems tangent that I hope is helpful for our listeners. So I'm thinking, because you talked about identity, about religious identity. Burge talks about this being increasingly downstream of party affiliation. So again, I'm thinking about from a family systems perspective, like you mentioned, in the 60s, one's primary identity was as a Christian or what have you. Now, like Burge notes, even the title evangelical is becoming less of a religious identity or marker and more of a political marker. So what's happening from like a family systems perspective there?
Yeah. So one of the family systems concepts is surrounding togetherness pressure. Yeah. Togetherness pressure is the pressure to conform to the norms and values of the system, of the relationship system. And what it used to be is we had a much larger tent, so to speak. For example, in my denomination, the United Methodist Church, we used to call ourselves a big tent, a large tent, where you could have you could have people across the theological and political spectrum. What happens when there's this chronic anxiety and the polarization starts to take place is that there's less room for difference. So then identity starts to have litmus tests, and those litmus tests, before they were religious, were political. Are you pro-life or pro-choice? Are you pro same-sex marriage or anti-same-sex marriage? Those became the litmus tests within Christianity, and what that really was politics co-opting our Christian faith, because Jesus, I think Jesus would say that there was room for us to have honest discussion about that, and to also have humility and say, one day we'll stand before God and we'll find out, But let's not, as he says in Matthew 7, let's not judge the other. Let's worry about the plank in our own eye.
Just read that this morning, actually, from your habits. Burge talks about this purification pressures, this chronic anxiety you just named that requires litmus tests. And I think what was really shocking for me reading about this is like he describes like through data that like the far edges of right and left are like really the far most vocal and influential of our political system right now. And he posits that there's a lot more of us actually in the middle, but because of these purification pressures, we all feel like we have to not just go along, but affirm what they're saying. So how do we get away from that? Like whether it's in society, whether in church, what have you?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least in terms of the society and the political system, I heard what's Stephen Dubner's the Freakonomics, Freakonomics podcast episode. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago, but it was on the oligarchy of the political system, and how they really benefit from just having two parties and having each other to fight. And what happens then is that in the primaries, your more extreme candidates win, right? Because the people with the most passion are at the edges, and so your MAGA and your AOCs, they're the ones who are kind of winning. Or in New York, Mamdani, right? And then so when you get to the general election, you don't even have a middle anymore. Yeah. And what interestingly in the Freakonomics episode, what they maintain is that the best way to fight that would be to have ranked choice voting, because if you have ranked choice voting, then it doesn't matter what party you are, the top 2 or 3 candidates or whatever, then face off in the general election, and that actually benefits the middle more than the way the parties work right now. I think in Christianity, it's really, really difficult because I believe that we've been co-opted by the political parties, so that even our leadership is I don't want to say it. Well, yeah, they're more to the edge than they are to the center. And depending on what kind of leader you have, you may or may not have tolerance for the center. And that's I think our bishop tends to allow for people to have differences of opinion. But even so, in our area, well, actually in the DC area, we're much more progressive, and the Maryland's Eastern Shore much more conservative. And so you have to have that allowance. What happens though is that we get so focused on the issues and allow the political polarization to take over, that we're not able to have conversations based on what we think Jesus would want. And I think one of the signs, I think, that you're leading right, you're leading properly, correctly, is you start to make a lot of people mad at you because you're not willing to go either far left or far right. You want to try to find a place in the middle, and that even happens in politics these days. People who compromise get castigated for compromising. But it makes me think of, I don't know if you've seen the He Gets Us ad campaigns.
Yeah.
I mean, from what I've read, the left is suspicious of it because I guess the Hobby Lobby guys got money in there. The right's suspicious of it because it sounds like a liberal message. One of my favorite ones is Jesus was a refugee. I mean, I mean, that when we start to look at things from a faith angle and look at, okay, what does our faith require us to do outside of politics? Then maybe we can start to have conversations about how we might do things differently that could influence politics. I think Dr. King, he had a vision of what could be, and he really wasn't political, but his, the civil rights movement changed minds such that politics changed as well. And that's kind of my hope for what might happen in the church. I don't see it happening right now, but that would be my hope. Yeah.
Well, let me stay on this somewhat controversial topic here, Jack, because I think this is important. Like, Burge again notes, I don't know if it's in this book, but certainly in data elsewhere, about how the mainline Protestant, most churches are by and large like very purple, almost uniquely divided down the middle. I somewhat wonder, like, is that partially as many folks who are left-leaning have left, but also like the reality is what it is. And he notes that a lot of the clergy are very like left-leaning, again, politically, from a political context. So like, I wonder, like, I don't know, because I think there's often this begrudgment, if not outright disdain, from mainline clergy of like, oh, my people are so centrist or conservative or middle of the road. And I don't know, folks might strongly disagree with me, but I'm like, I don't know. I just don't know how that's a healthy practice. Like, what is how should we go about that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is healthy. And it is defining others, judging others, instead of letting them be themselves. The way Friedman says it is to be a self and let others do the same. I'm thinking of when I heard my call to ministry back in 1990, I guess 89, 90. I was an insurance agent. One of my clients was a campus minister for the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of Delaware, and he was very conservative. IVCF is conservative. He was a Baptist. I told him I wanted to, become a United Methodist minister, and he goes, "Oh, Jack, I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and the whole time I was growing up, I never heard the gospel once. And I said, well, Will, don't you think that might be a good place to preach the gospel? And what it makes me think is, well, if you have a bunch of people who are middle of the road, what can you invite them to do? And I think inviting people to think is more important than anything, as opposed to telling them what to do. So challenging them to think about this, like, for example, in terms of immigration, because you look at the polling, right? People don't want illegal immigrants here who've committed crimes, but they don't want their neighbor down the street who's been a hardworking citizen or, hardworking neighbor for 20 years. They don't want them home. So sent home or sent back. This is home for them now. So what does it mean to find a place where you can actually honor people who are contributing to our society and at the same time not allow people who are not doing their part, who are criminals, to be deported? We're not asking people to think about where that middle ground is, and until we do that, I don't think we're going to get any answers. And even if we do, we might not. I mean, the political powers are pretty strong, but I would say that at least we should try. At least as people of faith, I think we should challenge people to think about how Jesus might want us to approach things.
So I'm thinking about this because Ryan Burge also notes that 5% of people, he says, have a, quote, need for chaos, like this desire to just burn it all down. And I literally just heard this like an hour ago as we're recording this from my brother-in-law, talking about a job he had working in software, or kind of high-end software tech for like car enthusiasts. And he was describing to me how like their business model was they're so often like reacting to what I think he used the word 5%, which is what's interesting here. But those 5% would say like, oh, we need this fixed now, rather than the 95% rest of the customers. So certainly we've all seen this dynamic playing out in churches or organizations. Like, what is a pastor or leader to do when you have like one or two of these, quote, 5% burn it all down voices who are just like demanding stuff? And I guess maybe more, I also want to hear this too, Jack. Like, how does one stay grounded and confident? Like, hey, I am doing the right thing, or I am being true to my values. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it is hard because they can gaslight you, right? They can they can make you think that you're on the wrong track. It is hard. What I do find though is that when you can model self-differentiation, when you can say what you believe, give others the freedom to disagree, not react, not get in a conflict of wills, not blame, then you are able to you're able to help others do the same. And so when you do that, you're actually creating healthy emotional space for others to try to remain non-anxious in that space. When you're dealing with the people who are trying to create chaos, I think there are two things that are really important. One is to stay connected to them, stay emotionally connected to them. And that means that you don't back away, you don't distance. And that's really hard because what we want to do is we want to avoid them. They're troublemakers. They're causing chaos. They're really anxious. This is not somebody I want to be around. And yet, if you withdraw from them, it's going to make it worse. So that's the first part is to try to stay connected to them. And then the other part is to get clear on what you really believe and what you're willing to accept. So, because if first of all, if you can get clear on your mission focus, your vision as a leader, and just and say to them, I understand you're upset about this. I understand maybe this isn't right or whatever. Yes, but I do believe this is the best way for us to achieve our mission. I do believe this is where God is calling us to go. And you've heard me say this millions of times. You don't have to agree with me, and I may be wrong, right? But so this staying focused on that mission and being able to articulate that, and then if they're really acting up, saying something like, I understand you're upset, but we're not going to be able to tolerate this kind of behavior anymore if it keeps up. And, so that's somebody who's, yelling and screaming in meetings, or they're standing up in church and making a ruckus. We can have conversation about this, but we can't tolerate that kind of behavior. It's going back to your 8-year-old son, right? It's the very same thing. It's getting clear on what you're willing to accept and what you're not, and then being willing to set a boundary, take a non-anxious stand.
Staying on this topic of thinking about what we can accept, give me some tangible, let's just stay on the topic of my son, for instance. He won't be listening right anytime soon. Yeah. So is that like, for me, like accepting, like, just to say, like, more clutter in the room than I might like, or maybe from a church member or parishioner, like some amount of dysfunction, or is that on track then, what you're saying?
Well, yes, or maybe not, Okay. So maybe it's really important to you that your son cleans up his room.
Sure.
Right. And I guess, one of the things is to get clear on what's important. Why does that matter?
Or what clean means to me, right?
Right. Or what clean, yeah. And what does it mean to him? I mean, that's a great conversation. Let me tell you what I think clean is. What do you think clean means?
Yeah.
And then being able to say, okay, here's what I'm willing to accept. I expect that you're going to get to this point, right? If and you need to stay in here until that's done, or I'm gonna give you until Thursday, and if it's not like that, then here's the consequence.
Yeah.
No TV, or whatever, no video games, or whatever the consequence. They used to say about my one of my son's friends used to joke about him, that when he got in trouble, his punishment was he couldn't watch Sports Center because he loves sports. Yeah. So, and so a similar situation might be in a church meeting where somebody is yelling at other people, and making them feel really bad, and what are you willing to accept? Well, and one of those general principles I might have is, we're all going to treat each other with respect. And if we can't do that, then you're not going to be welcome in this meeting. And so, I think those are how boundaries get set. And sometimes it means that people leave. I've, my coaching practice, I've worked with pastors who have set boundaries with people, and they've left the congregation. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't actually a bad thing. And so I think it's it doesn't always work, but it's better than getting reactive or just giving in.
Yeah, and I suppose this should be my last question on this, Jack, because I do think there's this like tacit acceptance that's also in the main line, this sort of like, oh, we can't lose anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, well, we're willing to put up with dysfunctional behavior because like we can't lose anybody. Like, our decline is such that like, if there's such an important giver or volunteer that we can just kind of put up with problematic behavior.
Yeah, and that I think that slowly eats away at the soul if you're a leader, because you may be making those decisions, but I think you're also, deep down, you're not valuing the principles that really matter, and so I have so this is a pastor, and his church ended up disaffiliating, but I think this story, to me, kind of represents the importance of sticking to your principles. They, back in the late 90s, he felt called to actually hire two of my clergy colleagues. They were actually friends of mine. To have them for a year in his church, and then send them to plant another church about 8 miles down the road. And in that, ask for 12 families, 12 of the most spiritually mature families to go with them. That church ended up being one of our most vibrant churches in the annual conference. They disaffiliated too, but that's content, not process.
Right.
But I remember this pastor telling me, like 3 months before the launch date, I said, "So how are you feeling about this?" And he said, "I'm a little bit nervous because I know that those 12 families represent about $150,000 in giving to this church."
Wow.
But I really believe that God's going to make it up. And then I saw him like a year later, and I said, "Well, so how's it going? What happened?" He goes, "God more than made it up, you know."
Wow.
And so I think when we really trust in God, when we really believe that by following the principles that we think are a part of what it means to follow Jesus, that God is going to take care of that. I think God shows up. I think about the civil rights movement and how they would do these they called them purification before their protests. They would pray. They would talk about what really matters to them. Why is this important? They would talk about not responding to violence with violence, and they would actually think about what it would mean to be hit and not hit back. And they did that trusting that God would do something with that. And it was really the fact that they didn't respond to violence with violence, I think, that changed the sentiment in the US on civil rights. So so I don't know, that was a long answer to a short question, but
that's all right. I want to ask one more question before we take a break, kind of on this theme of, again, process versus content. So I'm thinking about how, like, again, to think about this Burge book, like there's so much data that suggests like church attendance is good from a sociological and emotional standpoint. Certainly, like, I've tempted to make that sell to others, like, you should come if even just because of like, it's good stuff. Certainly, though, I think we can also say, like, if we reduce church attendance to being about sociological or emotional or even political emphases, like we can get off track. So, like, I would say, like, I believe, like, the point of church is the process. It's becoming made into or being formed into more disciples of Christ, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that content, hopefully I'm getting this on track here, how do we keep the process from getting crowded out by content, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Because if the only reason people are going to come to church is for the social and emotional benefits, I mean, there's a lot of places they can get that, right? I mean, in the small towns on the Eastern Shore, the Firehouse is probably even a better place for people to get that kind of connection. So I do think it's important to think about who we really are. What does it really mean to be a Christian? And to me, that is living and loving like Jesus, right? That's and we use the theological term sanctification. It's taking on the mind of and likeness of Christ. It's becoming more like Jesus. So I think the first thing we have to do is to challenge people. Do they want to live a life that it represents what God wants for the world? I mean, I think to me that challenges them to think about, well, there's more to life than just being comfortable. There's more to life than just having things. There's more to life than being, to having friends and feeling connected and feeling good. What the Christian faith calls us to is to represent the reign of God to the world. There's God. And so the first thing I think is teaching people what that is. What you're just talking about, the Sermon on the Mount. the Sermon on the Mount is a great way to help teach people about what God wants for the world, and I think it's radical. And I think the churches that do have kind of a higher bar for what it means to follow Jesus, whether that's progressive or conservative, I think those are the ones that are attracting people. I'm not sure of this, but I think I've heard that the Catholic Church is doing fairly well because they have high demands, although those demands might be more to the institution. I'm not sure about that, but I do think Friedman says he has a bias for challenge over comfort. And what he means by that is when you're just comforting people, it makes them weaker. And when you challenge people, it makes them stronger. And so I think challenging people to think about what it means to follow Jesus and how they might grow in that way is one way to stay focused on what I believe the mission of the church is, even as there are those other benefits. I love my church community and the connections I have there, but that's not the primary reason.
Yeah. Oh, well, I guess, again, to name our unnamed guest here, Brian Burge, I've read past stuff from him that, like, the ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America, seems to be one of the few denominations growing because they have, as he at least perceives it, high expectations for folks who attend. So there's some, at least anecdotal, if small sample size, perhaps, data to talk to that trend. Well, let's take a quick break. Really, again, Jack, great conversation here. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, do you need a minute? Otherwise, I'll just reintroduce you.
No, I'm good. Oh, I do. Interesting you talk about that high bar, because that church plant that I was talking about, anybody could attend, but if you wanted to be a member, you had to commit to tithe, to either do Alpha or walk to Emmaus, and to consider taking a leadership position. And so they were the exact opposite. About a third of their church were their worshiping attendants were members, whereas it's the other way around. In mainline churches, about a third of their membership are worshipers.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's interesting. That is. There's something there.
Yeah, Burge. I think Burge is onto something there.
Yeah. All right, we're back with Jack Shatama, and Jack, I know I've asked you these questions before at some point, but again, hey, your mind might have changed, and you're welcome to answer these from our current context or what have you. But if you're Pope for a day, or you were in charge of the mainline denomination, pick your denomination. I guess in your case, the Methodist Church, or if you're, I don't know, President of the United States, feel free to interpret this how you want. Like, what would you do from that day from like a family systems perspective?
Oh, well, I was actually thinking of it from a power perspective. If I were Pope for a day, I'd enable the ordination of women, I think. Just because I think it's, long past due.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't know about if I were like bishop in my denomination or even president. That would be a tough one. I think I'd rather be Pope.
How about this? Again, I'm trying to spin these all in family systems just so I can learn more here from you. Who's a theologian or historical Christian figure you think of as being well differentiated?
Well,
I mean, don't say Jesus, because that's the easy answer.
Because he is. He's the most differentiated. I think Moses is probably a good one too.
Okay.
And so it would be interesting to kind of see how he dealt with all of the anxiety in the Israelite. They weren't even a nation yet, but the complaining, right? And the talk about triangles between the people and him and God. And he seemed to be able to, for the most part, manage it as a non-anxious presence.
How about this then? I recently had a conversation with Bill and Christy Galtaire, who talked about empathy, but when I asked this, then we talked a little bit about Peter, disciple Peter, apostle Peter, his kind of emotional growth. again, we only have the source material that we have. Like, what do you think it was about Peter? Like, do you think there were some family systems perspectives or that enabled his growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was his denial, right? That was kind of his bottom, and because up until that point he was kind of I don't want to say the favored son, but he was one of the golden boys,
Right.
But I think that it kind of impeded actually his maturity, and I think when he actually went through that really low moment where he realized he'd really messed up.
Yeah.
He, I think he had an opportunity to grow from that, and I think he did. And that I've mentioned Bill Selby before. He founded the Center for Pastoral Effectiveness in the Rockies, and he says that a sentence never ends with a period; it always ends with a comma. And all that means is that you can always go back and reopen the conversation and say things like, "I didn't." What I really meant to say was, or I don't like the way I responded there, and here's what I want to tell you now. And I just actually had an email from a coaching client today where that happened with a colleague, and when you actually are able to take the time to sit back and think, okay, what went wrong here, and what would I do differently? You can actually do something differently. You can do something about it, and I think that's what happened with Peter.
Do you think, boy, that's interesting. I know I probably heard that comma versus period thing from you before, but I'm wondering, like, when we think about our current time and place, is that something that's like we put periods, again, to play with that metaphor so often at the end of people's comments? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, and first of all, we judge people by their beliefs instead of as persons, and I know a lot of people who are really nice people who, if I were to look at their politics, just look like, are you kidding me? How can you believe that? But I know that. In fact, I'm working on a podcast on Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, and what he basically says is, we have these moral foundations, and then when they feel threatened, we get reactive, and that's kind of what happens, I think, is and we rationalize what we believe. So it starts with our emotions, and then we rationalize it, which I've found to be true. We don't really know why we believe what we believe, and then we rationalize it. So
what do you hope for the future of Christianity? What do you hope for the church? How do you hope that we might live more faithfully into our future?
Yeah, I mean, I in one sense, I wonder if it's all going to come crashing down to be built up again. That's not what I hope for the church. What I would hope is that we have leadership, both lay and clergy, who can create space for others, and that through that, we might start to see people want to connect with Jesus and become more like Jesus. And I think that's a really hard thing because the institutional pressures are so great. You have to maintain the building, you have to pay the salaries, all of those things. And so in some sense, perhaps there might be movements of people, Christians who are free of that and can do things differently. I don't know if you know about the Fresh Expressions movement, but they're actually in our denomination. They're meeting next week in Florida, and these are people who aren't tied to necessarily a church building or an institution, even though they are connected kind of to a congregation in some ways, but they're out in the community, connecting with people and trying to be Jesus and show Jesus. And I think, to me, that is the hope I see, is that there are people who are trying to connect with other people and show them what they believe Jesus is about.
Well, I've kept you a good while here. So I really thank you for your time and the conversation. Share more how people can connect with you. I'll make sure to link the podcast, but again, give that a mention.
Yeah, the website's thenonanxiousleader.com, and you can find out about the books that I've written, and I've got some online courses, and I have a coaching practice. So that's thenonanxiousleader.com. And you can link the podcast. I do have a weekly newsletter, so you can subscribe to that at the website. And that's how you can connect with me. I always enjoy being here with you, talking to you, and as you know, we stay pretty well connected on a regular basis through our newsletters and email exchanges. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time. We always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.